you reacted. Maybe you defended yourself. Maybe you explained your position. Maybe you went silent in anger and then broke that silence with everything you'd been holding back. Maybe you cried. Maybe you raged. Maybe you sent the message you told yourself you wouldn't send. And the moment you did, something shifted in them. Not guilt, not remorse, not the sudden realization that they'd pushed you too far. Something else. Something that looked almost like satisfaction. You felt it, didn't you? That thing in their eyes right after you reacted. That almost imperceptible settling into calm. Right in the exact moment you lost yours. You weren't fighting back. You were feeding them. Never react to a narcissist. Here's what they want instead. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This video is not about teaching you to be cold. It's not about pretending you don't feel things. It's not about becoming someone who shuts down completely. It's about understanding what your reaction actually does inside the psychology of the person you're dealing with, so that for the first time, you stop giving it to them without meaning to. Because once you see what your emotional response is actually worth to them, you will never look at their provocations the same way again.
Think about the last time a narcissist provoked you. What was it about? Maybe they criticized something you were proud of. Maybe they dismissed something that mattered to you. Maybe they brought up something from your past at exactly the wrong moment. Maybe they simply said nothing when their silence was louder than anything they could have spoken. Whatever the content was, here is what it was not about. It was not about the actual subject matter. It was not about whether you were right or wrong. It was not about resolving anything. It was not about getting to the truth. It was about generating a specific thing from you. A response. An emotional response. And here is the part that changes everything once you truly understand it. The narcissist doesn't actually care whether your response is anger, tears, defense, silence, or desperation. All of them work. All of them feel exactly the same to the psychology receiving them. Because to a narcissist, your emotional reaction is not a sign that they've hurt you. It is a sign that they still have power over you. And power, confirmed power, is the only thing they came for. This is why defending yourself to a narcissist almost never works.
And I want to say that carefully, because the instinct to defend yourself is not wrong. It's human. It's healthy. In most relationships, it's exactly what you should do. But with narcissistic psychology, every defense you offer is received as something entirely different from what you intended. You say, "That's not what happened." They hear, "You still affect me enough to correct." You say, "You don't understand what I was going through." They hear, "I need your understanding. You still have something I want." You say, "I can't believe you would do that." They hear, "I am emotionally destabilized. You have successfully disrupted my internal world." Every defense, every explanation, every correction is supply. Not because your words are wrong, but because the act of responding at all confirms to their psychology that the provocation reached its target. And a provocation that reaches its target is always worth repeating. There is a concept in psychology called reactive abuse, and it is one of the most psychologically sophisticated weapons in the narcissist's behavioral toolkit, whether they use it consciously or not. It works like this. The narcissist provokes, pushes, tests, pokes, with words, with silence, with actions, with absence. They push until you react. And the moment you react, especially if your reaction involves anger or raised voice or saying something you immediately regret. The entire dynamic of the interaction reverses. Suddenly, they are the calm one. Suddenly, you are the unstable one. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what they did. It's about what you just did. And they will use what you just did for weeks, sometimes months.
See how you react? See how you lose control? No wonder I behave the way I do around you. The provocation was the trap. Your reaction was the door swinging shut behind you. Let's go inside what actually happens in the narcissist psychology the moment you react, because it's not what most people picture. Most people imagine the narcissist feels something like happiness, like a villain in a film who just won the argument. That's not it. What actually happens is more biological and more disturbing than simple satisfaction. Remember narcissistic supply from the last video? The constant need for external input to maintain a sense of self? When you react, when your emotional response reaches them, something in their psychology stabilizes. The internal chaos, the fragile ego structure that requires constant feeding, momentarily quietens. Your pain is their peace. Your destabilization is their stabilization. This isn't metaphor. This is the psychological exchange happening beneath every argument, every cold silence, every provocation you've ever experienced with this person. Your reaction is not just supply. It is the specific type of supply that regulates their internal emotional state. Which means every time you react, you are emotionally medicating someone who is addicted to your distress. Now, there are 3 specific emotional reactions that narcissists engineer most reliably, and understanding which one is being targeted in any moment is the first step to not providing it. The first is anger. Anger is the most visible reaction, the one that gives them the most immediate proof of power. When you get angry, you are loud, you are clear, you are undeniably responding to them. There is no subtlety required. The supply is obvious and immediate. The second is defense. Defense is quieter than anger, but arguably more useful to them. Because when you defend yourself, you are entering their frame of reality. You are accepting that the accusation requires an answer. You are treating their distorted narrative as something legitimate enough to push back against. And that acceptance, that engagement, is supply of the highest quality. The third, and this is the one most people never recognize, is grief. Your sadness, your devastation, your visible hurt. When they see you broken, when they see the weight of what they've done registering on your face, the effect on them is not guilt. For a psychology built on the need to feel powerful, your grief is evidence of how deeply they affected you. Evidence of significance. Evidence of power. Anger, defense, grief. 3 reactions, 3 types of supply. And every provocation is engineered, consciously or not, to produce at least one of them. So let's put this together. And I want you to think about this honestly, because this part is going to require looking at something you may not have wanted to see before. Every time they provoked, you reacted. Maybe with anger, maybe with defense, maybe with tears, maybe with all 3 in the same conversation. And your reaction temporarily satisfied the psychological need that drove the provocation. So the provocation eased for a while.
until the need built again, and the provocation returned, and you reacted again. You were not in a relationship with conflict. You were in a cycle of supply provision. A cycle that, as long as your reaction remained available, had no reason to stop. Because why would a cycle stop when it's working exactly as designed? The cycle doesn't break because they change. It breaks because you stop being a reliable source of what feeds it. And that begins with understanding one simple thing: what to do instead of reacting, which is what we are going to break down right now.
The first time you don't react, something very specific happens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but watch for it. Because once you see it, it tells you everything you need to know about the psychology you've been dealing with. When your reaction doesn't come, they escalate. The provocation that would usually produce an immediate response produces nothing. So they push harder. The criticism becomes sharper. The silence becomes longer. The accusation becomes more extreme. And here is what most people misinterpret in this moment. They see the escalation and think, see, this is why I have to react. Look how much worse they're getting. But the escalation is not evidence that ignoring them makes things worse. The escalation is evidence that your non-reaction is working. They are escalating because the supply didn't arrive on schedule. And a psychology that depends on supply, when supply is cut off, panics. The escalation is the panic. And panic, in a person who needs control, is the clearest possible signal that control is slipping away from them, not from you. There is a specific method for this. Psychologists call it the gray rock method. And despite its name, it is not about becoming emotionless. It's not about shutting down completely. It's not about pretending you don't exist. It is about becoming as psychologically uninteresting to the narcissist as possible. In the specific interactions where supply is being sought, short answers, flat tone, no emotional charge, no defense, no engagement with the content of the provocation. Not cold, not hostile, not dramatic in its silence, just unremarkable. The psychological equivalent of a gray rock sitting in a field. And here is why this works at the neurological level. The narcissist's brain is scanning for emotional response signals, just like a sensor built to detect a specific frequency. When that frequency doesn't arrive, the sensor has nothing to process, nothing to feed on, nothing to regulate against. And when the sensor consistently finds nothing, it begins, slowly, inevitably, to look elsewhere. So let's get specific. Because don't react is not a strategy without the understanding of what to do instead. And that's what nobody actually tells you. They say don't react. They don't say what to do with the feeling that still exists after you've chosen not to show it. The first alternative is physical separation before the reaction arrives. Not walking out dramatically, not making a scene of your exit, but recognizing the signs in your body that a reaction is building. The tightness in the chest, the heat in the face, the thought that begins with, I just need to say this one thing, and removing yourself before the reaction has something to attach to. A glass of water, a different room, a reason to leave the conversation that requires no explanation and gives no supply. The second alternative is the neutral acknowledgement. Not agreement, not defense,
not engagement with the accusation. Just a sound. Okay. I see. And nothing more. These responses are nutritionally empty to a narcissist. They confirm you heard. They provide nothing to escalate from. They give no emotional frequency for the sensor to detect. The third alternative is documentation instead of confrontation. Instead of reacting in the moment, write it down. Not to show them, not to use as evidence. To remove the pressure of the unspoken reaction from the immediate moment and release it somewhere that gives the narcissist absolutely nothing. The fourth, and perhaps the most powerful, is redirecting your emotional energy towards something in your own life that has nothing to do with them. Exercise, work, creation, connection with someone safe. Anything that consumes the energy the reaction would have used, and build something in your own world instead of destabilizing something in theirs.
Before we go into the power shift that happens when you consistently apply this, I want to ask you something. Which of those 4 alternatives do you think would be hardest for you personally? Physical separation before the reaction arrives? The neutral acknowledgement that gives nothing? Documentation instead of confrontation? Or redirecting your energy entirely? Drop it in the comments, just the number, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Because here's what I've seen consistently. The one that feels hardest is almost always the one you need most. And I want you to scroll through those comments and see how many people wrote the same number. Because the hardest one for you is the hardest one for almost everyone who has ever dealt with this specific psychology. You are not uniquely bad at this. You were just never taught what this actually was. Now, the power shift. Because once you understand what happens psychologically to both of you when the reaction stops, you will have something most people never find in this situation. Clarity. Real, permanent clarity about who actually holds the power in this dynamic. And the answer might surprise you.
Most people who have been in a relationship with a narcissist feel powerless, and I want to validate that. Not dismiss it, not rush past it. The experience of narcissistic abuse is genuinely disempowering in ways that are neurological, not just emotional. But here is something that takes time to understand, and that most people never fully grasp until they've sat with this information long enough to let it settle. The narcissist was never operating from a position of power. They were operating from a position of need. Power doesn't need someone else to react in order to feel real. Power doesn't require constant external confirmation to maintain itself. Power doesn't escalate when its supply is cut off, because power doesn't have a supply system. What the narcissist has, what it has always been, is dependence. Sophisticated, dominant-seeming, psychologically complex dependence, but dependence nonetheless. They needed you to react. They needed the reaction to regulate themselves. They needed the cycle to keep running, because without it, the internal architecture that passes for confidence begins to crack. The person who needed your reaction to survive was never the powerful one. You were. You just didn't know it, because you were too busy reacting to notice.
When this understanding actually lands, not just intellectually, but in the body, something changes about how you move through interactions with this person. The provocation arrives, and instead of the familiar surge of reaction, there is something else, a recognition. I see what this is. I see what is being sought. I see the need dressed up as aggression, the insecurity dressed up as authority, the hunger dressed up as indifference. And I am not obligated to feed it. That recognition, that single internal shift from reaction to clarity is not nothing. It is everything. Because it removes you from the role you were assigned in someone else's psychological maintenance system. And the remarkable thing, the thing that sounds too simple to be true until you experience it, is that they feel it too. Not consciously, not in a way they could name or explain, but on the level where supply is tracked, they feel the absence of your reaction as a loss of access. A door they could always walk through that is no longer open. And a narcissist standing in front of a closed door for the first time has to contend with the only psychology that was ever actually in control. Their own.
Here is everything in its simplest form. A narcissist provokes because they need a reaction, not because of what the argument is about, not because of what you did or didn't do, because the reaction itself, in any emotional form, is the supply that regulates them. Your anger, your defense, your grief, your silence eventually broken. All of it works. All of it feeds the system. None of it is random. And the alternative is not becoming cold. It is not performing indifference you don't feel. It is understanding deeply enough that the impulse to react begins to change on its own, not because you suppressed it, but because you can see clearly what the reaction was always being used for. You were never fighting someone who was stronger than you. You were feeding someone who needed you to keep them stable. And that is a completely different situation with a completely different solution.
I want you to sit with something before this ends. Think about the last time they provoked you, the thing they said, the way they said it. Think about how you felt in the seconds before you responded. Now, ask yourself honestly, what were you trying to achieve with your reaction? Were you trying to make them understand? Were you trying to prove something? Were you trying to take something back that felt like it had been taken? Whatever the answer, none of those things happened. Because your reaction was not received the way you intended it. It was received the way it was useful. And the moment you stop needing your reaction to achieve something with a person who was never going to receive it that way, is the moment something releases in you. Not because you've won, not because they've changed, but because you have stopped trying to be understood by someone whose primary experience of your emotional expression was always as a resource and never as a person.
If this shifted something, drop a comment below. The number from the alternatives, or just what this made you realize. Because someone else is going to read it and need to know they're not alone in it. Now, in the next video, we are going to go somewhere most psychology content never goes. We are going to talk about the specific things a narcissist says in the first month. The phrases, the patterns, the exact language that most people only recognize as manipulation after it's already worked. The words that make intelligent people hand over their trust before they've realized they've made a decision at all. If you've ever looked back at the beginning of something painful and thought, I should have seen it, that video will show you exactly what you were looking at and why you were designed not to see it.